Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guests today are Stefan Mitchev. He's the field CTO at Splunk. Robert Sheldon is the Senior Director for Public Policy and Strategy at CrowdStrike. Jim Smid is a Principal Architect for the DoD and intelligence communities at Palo Alto Networks. And Sean Pupanich, a Principal Technologist at AWS. It's good to have you all with us this morning.
Thanks, good to see you.
And you know, AI is emerging, has emerged, but AI itself is many things, and they're all kind of variating. So we have a really complicated landscape. Maybe it's a good idea to start, before we get to the threat landscape posed by AI, with some level setting of the, let's say, flavors of AI and what people need to know about what they mean when they say the word AI. Sean, you want to lead us off here?
Yeah, so if you look at the kind of history of AI, when we're not talking about sci-fi movies, it's predominantly things like machine learning, and more recently, generative AI. So when you think about the chatbots and stuff that consumers are starting to use, and really the rise in intelligence that we're seeing from AI, it's predominantly in that generative AI space. But there's quite a bit more to it, if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, certainly from the cybersecurity landscape, we usually certainly start with machine learning, which we've been doing for well over a decade, and I think most people are familiar with for baselining anomalies and to use it for detection purposes. So machine learning is not that new, but we've really seen a rise of tools themselves becoming easier to use, and that's partly being done through having generative AI tools, large language models, co-pilots, so the ability to kind of have best practices and somebody to help you through the tool, and natural language queries where you can take in plain English and find out some of the things that are happening with the tool and why those should go on. And finally, really, I think what we're seeing a bigger rise in is agentic AI, which is the ability for those tools to act on something, because you don't want to wait for necessarily a human actor to identify a problem. You need to mitigate risk as quickly as possible and to do some things to ensure you're as safe as you can be.
So the agentic then might be falling just short of totally autonomous because it has rules and guardrails around what the agent can do.
Absolutely. I think it's really a teamwork situation. You typically will see the tools do some things on their own. And again, those are usually low risk. You might terminate a session or lock a user account, create a trouble ticket, those kinds of things. And then you have playbooks and things that are recommended for the operator, and they get involved to really do the analysis portion of it.
So would a good way to differentiate between, say, machine learning and artificial intelligence as it's making the news, that the machine learning is doing its thing based on data generated by the particular process in time, whereas the later versions of artificial intelligence have much broader sources of data that may not be connected to the application that's running?
Yeah, that could be an example. One other way we look at it in industry is that machine learning tends to be a more efficient detection process. It takes a lot less compute, whereas generative AI is relying on tokens, and it's much more consumptive in terms of the compute it needs. So there are different applications for that. So for example, every byte that comes through a network, it may not be practical to have that reviewed by generative AI, but machine learning would be very effective at that. Whereas if you are trying to correlate events across a bunch of different systems, generative AI is actually a better fit for something like that, because it can understand the context of events from different systems.
And so for our purposes today then, the idea of agentic ties the generative to something you would want to do with the generative information, or the information so generated.
Yeah, you're now giving it tools and actions that it can take, and there are various techniques you can use to make that more predictable. So agentic workflows are a way to narrow the scope of actions and decisions that AI can make to get more consistent results.
Yeah, it's certainly about all the different flavors working together. It's not typically you're using just one form, right? Data, the more data you have, the better your machine learning will be, and the better it is at recognizing patterns and doing things. And then you need to feed it into AI models that can make decisions and do other things based on what it's finding.
Okay, so we now have cybersecurity directed at different threats at different industries we're seeing targeted one by one serially. Government is always in the mix of what's being targeted. Specifically, how is AI starting to change the threat landscape?
Yeah.
Let's talk about it from the bad guy standpoint first.
Sure. So in due course, we'll get to how the good guys are employing AI as well. But threat actors are absolutely looking at leveraging AI to facilitate or effectuate their attacks across all different industries and sectors. You mentioned government. They're obviously one of the sectors that has one of the most severe threat environments. But really, we see it in hospitality, we see it in retail, we see it in critical infrastructure, and every other sector you can imagine as well. Threat actors are leveraging generative AI for things like employing social engineering to try and make sure that they're communicating in a way that's going to be most likely be received well by their potential victim. So it's using it to, sometimes there's a language barrier that they can help navigate through putting a script of some kind into a generative AI chat session. We also see them using it for things like vulnerability discovery and a number of other techniques that threat actors might have done manually previously, but the advent of generative AI tools is making that sort of more accessible to them or helping them reach greater scale so that they can attack more different victims. And there's a variety of other ways that threat actors are targeting AI systems themselves, either through prompt injection or data poisoning and similar sort of techniques. And because so many enterprises are bringing AI into them, there are some vulnerabilities that will be exposed through that. So threat actors are always attuned to new vectors to attack victims, and this is certainly one that they're very interested in now.
And you mentioned prompt injection, that is asking questions that would give an answer or to create a process that the organization would never do itself.
Trying to find clever ways to interact with maybe AI systems that are already natively there in an enterprise in a way that will have the AI give a potential user, maybe an authorized user, an answer that really wouldn't be favored by the sort of customer themselves or by the user themselves. So it's finding techniques for the adversary to sort of bend the answer.
So to give a parallel example to traditional security, if you're familiar with SQL injection, it's a manner in which you're injecting information that allows you to bypass the security of that system and then get data out that you weren't supposed to. And so similarly in AI, there's a technique, prompt injection, that can potentially allow you to bypass some guardrails or get access to data. So that's why the design of the system and making sure that the AI itself has limited access is an important way to help protect against that. But also simple stuff like sanitizing your inputs, which has been a challenge for years in software development and cybersecurity.
So prompt injection, that could be a technique used by the insider threat as well as external,
Yes.
I would think.
Yes.
Yeah, we think that there's going to be an extreme nexus between these AI systems, especially as they get more, as you use them for more agentic capacities and sort of the insider threat, because threat actors will be able to leverage these things in ways that, because the AI is already there and sometimes has trusted access to different systems, data, or processes, that they'll be able to help effectuate or reach scale with attacks that are sort of insider threat based.
And you mentioned poisoning also.
Yeah, so being able to manipulate data sets, for example, that AI might draw on to be able to, again, give an answer that is able to be leveraged in some way by the threat actor or used for malicious purposes.
So it could be obsolete data even. I mean, that could be something that someone does even accidentally.
Well, there's a really interesting challenge in terms of the adoption of bringing AI into the enterprise, because people are trying to do this quickly because they're trying to maybe keep pace with different players in their sector that are also integrating AI. So there are a number of challenges just in terms of permissions, what data some of these systems have access to, and then how organizations see their comfort level with sort of some of these agentic systems to be able to take actions on their behalf. And there are different sort of architectures for how to use these. Sometimes it's an agentic system within an application itself, and that can be relatively trusted. And then there are sort of more experimental varieties where things like that, like what data stores have access to, what are the permissions and whatnot, how auditable is it, can become relevant and certainly could be exploited by a threat actor. But certainly, like other areas of cybersecurity, misconfigurations and the like can also lead to some very bad days.
Yeah, so therefore one of the dangers in cyber used to be simply that systems administrators and their rights could be exploited. But with AI more diffuse in its use throughout an organization, it seems to maybe broaden the threat to more people, either, again, maliciously or inadvertently causing problems.
Yeah, this is one of these scenarios where some of the classic manifestations of different security issues or vulnerabilities will appear in AI as well, and certainly sort of permissions, auditability, service accounts, and some of the hygiene around that will all sort of apply in various ways as people bring AI systems into the enterprise.
Yeah, so like someone working disgruntled inside a restaurant chain could ask of the generative AI, give me 100 reasons why nobody should eat at our stores.
For example.
Right.
Yeah.
You can see that map over to a lot of different
Yeah.
domains.
Yeah.
Well, the question is, are government agencies starting to realize this and think in a different way, Stefan?
Absolutely. Initially, as you remember, when generative AI became a reality, government agencies banned the use. And the reason was twofold. One of them was the nascency of the technology and its ability to hallucinate. And the other one was the fact that no one was trained how to use it. So basically, you would not recognize some of those threats, but in addition to that, you would go to websites which are not your government agency's website. So although the model will be there, you do not know what's going on with your data. Over time, we realized that you will become a force multiplier, you will become an extreme accelerator. And we've used machine learning for a lot of time, and I'm saying we because I used to be the CTO for the United States Patent and Trademark Office for the last 6 years, 5.5 years. We used a lot of machine learning in how we make decisions, how we look at threats, how we look at business as well. With the advent of Gen AI, we took a pause, and then many agencies realized that AI is not going to make their teams smaller. They're going to make it actually much more efficient. And specifically in security, that will be very important because you have your threat actors becoming extremely efficient, and probably we'll talk later about the different types of accelerators that exist in both areas. But it is an utmost priority right now. Cybersecurity has been and continues to be the utmost priority within most agencies.
Because there are areas in which we are seeing, at least in the commercial sector, reductions in staff with AI in in coding, for example, where they're reducing the number of hand coders and using AI. But in cyber, you're saying what we need is efficiency of the people we've got and not fewer people.
Yeah, so we know that the rate in which attacks come in is dramatically increasing, and that's because of the automation, the fact that you can have an agentic solution creating an attack. And that is beyond human level reaction at this point. We know that as you employ the same solutions to solve the problem, you actually have to be on the offense from an agency perspective. Defensive posture no longer helps here. So you need to exercise your own systems for your own security with similar tools that you'll be exposed and attacked with.
I would just jump in there and say, I usually bring it down to the speed, the scale, and the sophistication. Those are all really manifestations of those tools being used against us. And to your point, you have to make the operators you have much more efficient, and being able to leverage all those tools is what really makes them effective. Gone are the days of expecting someone to sit and watch alerts and to correlate data themselves and to identify where there's problems. That becomes a needle in the haystack, and too many things will get missed and overlooked. The data correlation isn't there, so those tools and the combination of them is what makes those operators more effective and more efficient.
I do want to point out a bit of an asymmetry, though. So both attackers and defenders will have access to the same types of technology. So AI will be a force for productivity and good, and it'll be a force for using it to come up with bad things to do. But the difference is, if I'm an agency or a business or a cybersecurity organization, when I'm trying to automate things, my level of performance needs to be pretty high. I need to have like a 99% accuracy, maybe 95% at the lowest, before I'm willing to adopt and implement that. Whereas if I'm an attacker, if I can get 50% accuracy, 25% accuracy even, that might be an extra $100 million in revenue for me as a cyber criminal. So my standards for absolute accuracy is much lower, so I'm willing to deploy that faster and just kind of throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. Whereas if you're defending a large organization or agency or sensitive information, you can't do that, right? You need to know that it's going to work. You need to test it very thoroughly. And so that asymmetry is going to be a challenge as these threats start to scale up. And so that's one of the reasons why I don't think you'll see a significant reduction in force in cybersecurity, because they're going to need to become more efficient to address this asymmetry of rising threats.
Right, it's almost parallel to people that used to do just email reach outs. If you have 1% of 1/10 of 1% of the people open and take action, you've made your payroll.
Yep, exactly.
Whereas, if you're a federal agency, like you say, you've got to have 99.59 of accuracy in what you do and deliver to the public. Okay.
I can add to that one. I think that's very, very good point. Each agency, each organization out there is basically, every employee has to be a sensor. That's always how I think about it. Well-trained workforce becomes a sensor into your security solution. You cannot protect the organization if your employees, if your workforce is not bought into it. Well-trained, capable of recognizing, capable of actually reporting it and not just deleting an email. Because that report, which I'll be honest, I've sometimes just delete them, but I know the value of actually reporting an email, a phone call, an activity that you observe, and that feeds into that knowledge base that ultimately helps you automatically protect and give that autonomy to those agents now that you deploy to actually help in the remediation process.
Okay. Yeah. Good insight. Yeah. Just don't delete it, but tell somebody.
Yep.
And that's even more important now. I mean, if before this was the major vector for this was sort of email, and you had some technical indicators associated with a phishing attack or campaign against your organization, you could sort that out. But increasingly, as people are getting being reached out to via phone or on social media networks or things that are not inside the sort of standard boundaries of the enterprise. So if you're not being able to identify, in some instances, something that's suspicious that's attacking you through one of those vectors and be able to report to someone internally, then there's not it's not going to be straightforward to defeat it from the standpoint of the enterprise defender. So, and there's a lot more sophisticated tools these days for people to sort of use AI to train voice tools and things like that, so people can impersonate one another pretty effectively. So having this perspective of making sure that the workforce remains educated and is in a mindset to see something, say something is so important these days.
And don't talk to spam calls, because it might be fun to play around with them, because then they've got a sample of your voice.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's actually gone to the point of video as well.
Yes.
So there was someone I know that actually got a fake call from Interpol.
Yep.
They tried to get them to engage on a Zoom call, and then they had the whole fake background and uniform and everything to try and reinforce this psychological idea that this is legitimate.
Yeah.
And it wasn't. So it's really interesting how far they can take it. Whether it's text, voice, image, video. It's become very advanced.
Just the amount of voice and video of us in this session is plenty to train.
We've been copied.
Yeah, exactly. So, and it's a real problem, because people are often, when they use this sort of technique, they're often impersonating people in senior leadership roles. Most people in senior leadership roles in a lot of different companies are out doing some sort of public affairs work, or they're doing media appearances, they're doing speeches, even town halls and things like that are recorded and put online. So there is a trivial ability at this point to take some of that just video and voice that's out there, be able to duplicate it, and then to call an employee and say, we need you to authorize a wire transaction in some instances, or I need you to reset my password in other instances, and things like this.
Yeah, so I guess I didn't really get invited to that state dinner as the phone call.
Regrettably.
From the White House. Yeah, I had a feeling it wasn't real, but you never know. It's easy to buy in sometimes. Well, for agencies that are in a risk management mode, because nobody has all of the resources they need to do everything, they turn to threat intelligence and some of the numbers that is going on in the market. Tell us more about that idea.
Yeah, sure. So we always say at CrowdStrike, it's so important to know your adversary, and the reason for that is that it's really central to understanding what sort of defenses you need to take and how seriously you need to take them. So this concept of having a threat model, understanding who's targeting you, why, what their objectives are, and how that might change over time. Not just because it informs what measures you should take for your security program, but also might inform things like how much travel you want your executives to do, or employees, or where, to what countries, or whether an M&A or a development project in a foreign country, for example, might make sense or not make sense from a security perspective. So having a threat model is so important. So we work, and others in the industry work, to get information out that really goes sector by sector and says that this is what we're seeing, targeting retail, hospitality, government, water, other critical infrastructure sectors, and then to just try and have information out there that the people who are in defender roles in those sectors can use to try and understand what sort of investments they should make or what sort of changes that they might make. So obviously AI, the topic of this conversation today, has been a huge thing that we've seen and targeting many different sectors, or threat actors leveraging AI rather, targeting many different sectors. Increasingly recently that's been in government and retail. Critical infrastructure sectors, of course, are always needing to be looking out. And another one that we've seen that's been a little bit creative, I think, and really been enabled by the advent of generative AI is some remote IT worker scams, and that's something that people need to be really alert to. We talked earlier about insider threat. People are putting together some pretty sophisticated fake resumes, creating social media profiles, and being able to participate in video interviews, persuasively looking like somebody else, sounding like somebody else. And then people are hiring these employees who often are North Korean workers. Right. They're trying to get money to fund illicit activities by the North Korean regime. They're doing, in some instances, a pretty proficient job at the work that they're hired to be in. And often, because they've made it through a hiring process, they actually have a device that was sent to them by the organization. And that makes doing security hard, because you're not able to use some of the classic cues you'd use as a defender to understand if somebody was accessing a part of your network from a different device or from a different area. So they also have really sophisticated staging areas where they're putting these devices in IT farms. So sometimes like geolocation techniques aren't working. And you really have to be sophisticated about bringing some of these concepts and the understanding of this specific threat vector into your hiring process and HR process, and that requires partnership with a lot of different organizations that sometimes the security teams and organizations aren't classically in a dialogue with. Now they have to be.
You can spoof location, in other words, now with AI.
Yeah.
So it could be, you think it's Nebraska, but it's really North Korea or China or something like that.
Yeah, and there's been technical means to do that for forever. People use hot points to be able to sort of obfuscate where they are in real time. But if you have a device, you can often find someone through the gig economy essentially who will receive that device. They'll plug it in. They'll be able to use some sort of mechanism, either software or hardware, to be able to essentially complicate and further obfuscate the fact that there's another connection going into that device from elsewhere, often in actual North Korea or from a North Korean worker in China or elsewhere in Asia. So that's something that's like really challenging to look at. Obviously, there's some ability for we in the industry to detect this sort of thing. It's just it's a little bit beyond the scope of what a normal SOC analyst might do in a given day, at least before we've collectively put out some reporting about this sort of thing.
Right. Okay. Good. And you mentioned other organizations, and before we move on, that you need to be part of and involved with and communicate with. What are, maybe elaborate on that point a little bit.
Sure. Well, it's important if you're an enterprise and you maintain a security program to just be dialed into what's happening, because things are changing. In security, they've always changed rapidly, but now, especially with threat actors' use of AI, it's just changing so rapidly. So have some vendors that you partner with that are attuned to the threat, but also be participating in information sharing groups, whether that's at the sector level or ISACs, or whether you're partnering with different law enforcement organizations or other information sharing groups, just to make sure that you're attuned to the changes and threats, because the thing that's the greatest risk to your enterprise next month may not be the same thing that it was last month or this month.
Okay, so you got to stay fast on your feet.
Indeed.
And go ahead.
I would just add in, I think industry's role in being collaborative with threat intelligence is, I think we have a fiduciary responsibility to be on top of what these new threats look like. And Palo Alto Networks, our Unit 42 is our threat intelligence team. Mm-hmm. We collaborate with the rest of our industry, and we also act as a SWAT team that can come in and help in the case of an event or to prevent an event. But as it goes to AI, AI is just applied data science, and you've got to have a lot of data coming in. You've got to be able to manipulate it, but you need that expertise. And because things are evolving so quickly, what that threat intelligence team does is they're continually taking things from a threat from an adversarial nation state, some of these very large-scale attacks and things we see, and those are being added back into the tools. There's a direct relationship of that expertise in creating new artificial intelligence models, and to really take that what we've learned and make sure the tools themselves become better every day.
And I wanted to ask you, Jim and Sean, I mean, it used to be that you protected yourself by devices and procedures on the infrastructure, on the network. What are state-of-the-art ways now, because that still figures into cyber threats, but what are some of the contemporary ways agencies you see are defending themselves in the AI-empowered era?
So, one important thing to point out is, the answer to AI is not necessarily just more AI. There's a lot of core foundational security frameworks and strategies today that are actually pretty effective in a lot of the threats that we see. If you look at AI as not entirely a new threat, but more a supercharging of existing threats, so increasing the number of maybe low-skilled actors that can complete a higher skilled attack, and increasing the productivity of higher skilled attackers to proliferate those. The NIST cybersecurity framework, strategies like zero trust that presume breach. So when we were talking about those really crafty ways in which they are showing up as an employee, a remote employee, or even manipulating an employee in order to gain access to internal systems. In a presumed breach scenario, where you are having strong layers of observability, you're using AI to help you identify changes in behavior, even for someone that is fully authenticated, fully authorized. These are things that exist today that can be used to help mitigate some of these threats that we're starting to see in larger volumes.
Yeah, I would say the lines have really blurred. We still have to do the same things we've traditionally done around infrastructure and partnerships with AWS, for example. We need to be able to protect the network, protect the compute, but also be able to identify, as they're starting to leverage services from someone like AWS, new Gen AI tools and other pieces of it, needs to be more sophisticated. And as Sean was talking about the frameworks, I always think of it as an ecosystem of tools. So even if it's zero trust, you really need to think of, there's a lot of moving parts, and that whole interoperability side and tying it all together is, I think, such a critical piece, because you can't take these siloed tools and make them just do their own thing in a corner. They have to interrelate. When you start dialing back the DoD's activities around zero trust, each one of those activities can take a dozen or a half dozen different tools from a lot of different pillars, and you have to then tie that back into the automation side and the visibility and analytics at the end. So it's kind of the marriage of a lot of different technologies and a lot of different tools, and then being able to measure that at the analytics and visibility, which is really what we're all talking about from an effectiveness and efficiency of your operators.
And then I guess you would have to map that back to your threat model that you have to have.
For sure.
And that's where the imagination comes in, is asking yourself, what do they really want from my organization? What do I think would be the biggest dangers? And if you can bring all those, or I guess maybe the word is orchestrate all of those pieces,
you
might have a shot.
Absolutely, and again, it gets to your last question around threat intelligence, because we recognize from a lot of best practices on what we're seeing, where the adversaries are going with different types of attacks, and recognizing those and being able to shut down those threat vectors.
And AI is even a great tool for threat modeling, so your teams can use it today to define your systems, design your networks, and establish a threat model.
If I might add to this, observability is really important. I come from a product delivery background, not security or infrastructure. And one of the things we've noticed as you build business products is that when threat comes at them on any level, whether it's infrastructure, network, actual application level, or even behavioral level, if you can't see it, you cannot secure it, and you cannot scale it. So observing your entire stack, whether that's cloud-only, cloud-native applications that you've developed, or they're hybrid because you're in the middle of transitioning or modernization, they're on-prem, or they're even air-gapped, that requires a unified kind of view, so that your SOC, your threat analyst, can actually see a full picture of and react accordingly. So that is, I always see observability and security being just the same coin, just different faces of it, and they're really tightly interconnected.
And that question of observability, it comes up a lot now because, like you say, you can't protect it if you don't know it's there or you can't see it. And I imagine that your cloud service provider, Sean, can be a good partner in achieving observability because whatever's in the AWS cloud, you can help clients see.
Yeah, so a big part of the core design of cloud is having a lot of that observability built in to the foundational parts of the network. So we're generating telemetry that can be used by other tools. So it doesn't necessarily solve the problem on its own, but whereas something would be very difficult to set up, configure, and get telemetry for in a traditional infrastructure, the cloud's designed from scratch to include that information, which means that you can then use these other tools to view and make decisions about it.
That's really critical on our partnership with AWS because we take a lot of the telemetry information and it's about simplifying that visibility and presenting it in a single place that you can simplify it for operations and from a management standpoint. So that cooperation and collaboration, I think, goes a long way in making that effective.
Yeah, there has to be, I guess, some kind of abstraction down to the so-called, pardon the old expression, but single pane of glass.
Absolutely.
For you, the client operator. Otherwise, it's chaotic and nobody can keep up with everything.
Too many places to look.
Yeah, this is such a good point because what we've seen is what we call cross-domain attacks really proliferating. So people are targeting the classic endpoints on an enterprise. They're targeting cloud environments. They're targeting SaaS applications. They're targeting esoteric endpoints like critical infrastructure and IoT. So being able to get telemetry from all those disparate environments, being able to pull them back so that you have situational awareness across your entire federated network is so important to being able to ensure that you're adequately hunting for threats and defending them where you find them.
And Stefan, I wanted to get back to something you mentioned earlier, especially with your experience at PTO. It seems like for agencies to be able to deal with the modern contemporary situation we've got with AI-powered cyber threats, you need more than just upskilling, to use the current term, but almost a different way of looking at things, cultural change, if you will.
Culture is probably the biggest enabler. And one thing that I remember when I started within the PTO is that culture had to migrate from a siloed view of activities, projects, contracts, into more of an enterprise and highly aligned to your products. And one of the changes that, cultural changes that we did was move to a product-centric mode of operation rather than project-centric. So we had persistent teams, cross-functional teams, minimizing the critical partnerships between a product team and a database team, for example, which allows much higher velocity. One aspect of this was how do you build in security into it? Security's cyber team is traditionally very, I wouldn't say old school necessarily, but there's a very prescriptive way how to work there, and that has to evolve, and that has evolved recently in many organizations. So how do you build this interaction between product teams and cyber teams so that you pull all the visibility, the observability, the best practices, the compliance aspect early into the product development life cycle? One way that we found that is through continuous operations, like continuous authority to operate. How do you build that aspect as well? How do you encode, as you're writing your product, how do you encode those policies and narratives and control implementations into the code itself? How do you extract this and create your compliance, but really focusing on operational security first? So there's a lot of real-time changes that are happening within teams, things that shifted much more to the left. And that's not a cliche anymore. That is really how do you start to build your product where the first piece of code that you put in is actually business functions, not boilerplate, because that's already something that should be already given to you, validated, tied to all your observability and security systems, tied to infrastructure, be ready to automatically deploy to your cloud environment in a secure way, tying into your authentication, authorization frameworks. So I think that was one of the biggest changes that we've created, that we've seen the most impact, reducing startup projects from months to minutes, actually.
It sounds like that's a good use case for agentic AI to make sure that those policies and qualities are in fact coded in they used to say, we can't bolt on cybersecurity, we have to program it in. Seems like agentic AI could make sure that happens.
AI in general does. Agentic takes action. So I think that what's important there is by having automated pipelines which act like agents technically, but they're augmented with AI. They're slightly different than truly an agentic automation. Ultimately, that allows teams to have that certainty of moving quickly forward as they implement their solutions. Agentic automations in general are critical within every security system. So as a developer, one would rely on the tools that are given at their disposal within the reference pipeline that they're using to give them almost real-time feedback of how they're doing in their development lifecycle. Something I'm very excited about is with Splunk, for example, we have an MCP server now deployed. And I can imagine myself in the shoes of a developer writing a piece of code, an update to my application that's already in production, asking my agentic assistant, my AI assistant, to analyze production events and point to the code of my current release candidate of where that there may be some optimizations that might be necessary. I think that real-time interaction is actually extremely powerful. We can see that in low environments, in production environments. We can see it in threat analysis. I wish we had this when Log4j hit, because that would have minimized that blast radius analysis within minutes. And we all remember what that was for all of us.
Yes, we do. So in other words, you can almost compress the testing and what could possibly go wrong type of scenario into the development and deployment so that it almost happens simultaneously.
The threat analysis, the detection, the response from network security and product tiers, if you will, that is what I would imagine would actually start to merge into a single kind of highway of analysis and response.
Oh, I was just going to say that's really, we think of it the same way, and we call it from code to cloud, right? That you do a better job of eliminating the volume of vulnerabilities if you can back up and you can address them during the coding cycle. And you going back to visibility and how important that is, having visibility from that entire life cycle. Am I putting secrets in? Am I putting something as simple as an IP address or a password that's being coded in there? What's my supply chain look like for how I'm doing my software development? Do I have libraries that have known vulnerabilities? Because the way we do cloud native applications today, a single vulnerability introduced and potentially shared by multiple developers can extrapolate into thousands of vulnerabilities in your runtime environment. So being able to kind of have that full visibility and seeing that life cycle of products, that's how you start to get a handle on how many potential vulnerabilities you have in the runtime environment, your gold standard.
Yeah, so two points to that. From the culture perspective, what I've seen effective in the private sector is companies that are preaching security as everyone's responsibility versus just the security team's responsibility, and implementing that in practical ways and in trainings like how can you be affected, how can you affect the organization. That goes a long way. And that what is kind of the stepping stone to getting teams like development teams to take security more seriously, use these new agentic tools, whether it's through code generation or what I've seen really effective is the code review, like you were saying, where it can look for best practices, it can look for common security vulnerabilities and stop those at check-in versus once it's already out and there's a whole economic cycle of, did that affect customers, did that affect the support staff that now have to report and document all this, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not just the individual developer's productivity, but it's everything that it affects. When you're reducing the number of vulnerabilities, reducing the number of cyber attacks that are effective, it's a big cycle.
All right, so let's look at the government's kind of, bouquet of strategies and policies for cybersecurity that have been in place sometimes for a long time. Zero trust, you hear, and the DoD says they're going to be totally zero trust. I think it's by 2027, or I forget the year, 29, but they're working on it. We've had the whole software supply chain and the SBOM initiative. Now that's going back to 4 or 5 years at this point. CDM, continuous diagnostics and mitigation. Is that all add up to effective ways for agencies to deal with AI-powered threats nowadays? We can all comment on this one.
Yeah, I think I think everybody in the government should be asking themselves precisely this question: like, what are the tools that we have to address the changes in this landscape? And that's both from just like the normal core business function standpoint, and then also just when they're looking at security specifically. And there are some programs, you mentioned CDM, that have aimed to bring capabilities from industry into government. And it's worth asking questions now, just like, okay, so that program's a number of years old. Is it the case that it's designed in a way that will allow us to leverage all the capabilities that our counterparts? If I'm a CISO in the federal government and I have a counterpart in industry and they're using some sort of tool, like, is it possible for me to get that tool through the programs that exist? And if not, it might make sense to sort of update those programs in light of some of these changes. I think it's important to note, though, that it's not just people aren't just going to the AI store to purchase an AI, right? It's like there's a lot of applications that government uses now that already integrates AI, and that future versions will integrate AI more natively. So it's worth, again, asking the question, but understanding that the landscape's changing so much that actually some of the current capabilities that are in use in government may integrate some of these capabilities over time. And then it's just a matter of making sure that people in government have the sort of knowledge, expertise, comfort, and authorities to be able to sort of use those capabilities. And on that note, there was a series of executive orders released a couple of weeks ago from the federal government that essentially were directing everybody to really contemplate the use of AI, and then to and some of the authors of these executive orders in OSTP and elsewhere in the White House have kind of come out and said directly, just because your specific use case is not identified in the EO doesn't mean that it prohibits you from investigating it. So everybody in government, be advised, you should be looking at the use of AI, and certainly we hope that people in security functions and roles are doing that right now.
Yeah, for sure. From this White House, I think some of the strictures from the earlier policy are definitely off, the AI industry and also users of AI.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because you really have to address a lot of these emerging problems, as well as address simultaneously, zero trust has been around for a long time, and my customers always talk about, I need to consolidate, I need to integrate, and I need to accelerate how fast I'm doing this. And at the same time, I need to worry about these other attack vectors, whether that's the convergence of IoT coming in, and how do I use machine learning to kind of help with that? How do I look at things like post-quantum cryptography? How do I look at things like just the adoption of Gen AI tools? All of those are further complicating it, and it's also difficult for agencies sometimes to get their hands on, as Rob was saying, the latest and greatest tools, because we have certification issues and things that come into, if I have a cloud delivered service and I have a requirement that would require FedRAMP IL5, well, that might be 2-3 years out. So to some degree, I'm tying my hands. I'm not able to use some of the latest and greatest tools, where our adversaries will come to the table. I think, as Sean was pointing out, they don't have to be successful. They're going to try it. And
early adopters.
So there's a lot that goes into. It's a difficult task, and I think it's a collaboration between us as industry and our counterparts on the federal side.
I think public-private partnerships is the key here for solving a lot of those problems. And I look at it from two separate ways. You have the one way, which is your more infrastructure-related, application-related attacks and threats that you have. But then you have the business attacks, the one on the business level, where you can, at this point, experience a denial of service from actual legitimate traffic, just fraudulent. And that's interesting because, for example, in the patent office, I can imagine an actor using Gen AI to create so many applications at such a fast pace that detecting it on the business level, what actually is fraud versus what is a real submission is, and that applies to every agency that
overwhelms it. Yeah.
Overwhelms it. Yeah. That applies to every agency that works with public customers, right? So how do we actually transpose this automation, this detection to look at the traditional security landscape of your systems, but also at your business processes as well, because that is equally as important. That enables or breaks companies. The other aspect of this is that when you use AI, and we talked about whether that's going to displace people or skill sets for that matter, you have to be really well versed in code architecture, in system design, in the ability of how to organize a product, how to build a product, to actually use AI effectively. If you just vibe code a production program, you know exactly what that happens. That does not work in production. It works great for prototyping. I think that is where AI is the biggest enabler in creativity. It forces us to build new things. But ultimately, you still have this body of knowledge and skill sets that has to be even sharpened even more at this point.
All right, Sean, final word.
So I think that it is important to get some of these newer technologies in the hands of the government. I would say, though, the government as a whole is still challenged to change quickly. So even a lot of the best practices prior to AI, I think they're still working to implement. And so if we can get support across government, not just in spirit, but in resources, I think that would go a long way to help close some of these gaps that exist today and get them prepared for the future that is changing at a much quicker rate.
All right, well, I want to thank everybody for a really great discussion, some actionable information, and we'll hope the agencies take your advice. I'm Tom Tem, and you've been watching this series, Accelerate Together, Secure by AI. For more on this discussion, please visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Accelerate Together.